All right, let me welcome everyone to our 5th Lunch and Learn in this second series. It's the first of 2021. Our speaker today is Audrey Polinsky. For those who know how much Audrey does around HERJC, you might be surprised to learn that she also has a day job. She's a wealth management advisor, and she has many years experience, and she's going to be speaking today about long-term planning. All right. If anybody has any questions, I guess hold them at the end and then you'll be happy to answer, Audrey.
Sure, or throw them in the chat box. But I have a lot of material to get through, so I would imagine that some of the questions that you may already have will get answered.
Okay, fine.
So
with no further ado.
Thank you.
Go.
So I think arguably there is no other unexpected event in life that creates more lasting damages to a family than the need for long-term care. And when we talk about long-term care, there are 2 types of impairments that we'll recognize. The first is physical, and we'll define that as a chronic debilitating illness, such as Parkinson's, MS, or a stroke, or even just becoming old and frail. We can manage these chronic illnesses with drugs and therapy, but they cannot be cured and will get worse over time. And when we talk about cognitive impairments, those are definitely marked by a decline in intellect to the point that an individual needs constant supervision. And what we know is as the impairment progresses, they compromise an individual until they're no longer safe. The reality of this causes serious consequences, not necessarily to the individual who is not well, but rather than to those who are around that person, who have little choice but to put their lives aside to provide care. And these consequences really affect the client's family. The demand for care quickly becomes all-consuming to caregivers, resulting in what we know, well-documented, both severe emotional and physical stress to the family. If there are children, it compels at least one of them to place his or her life aside. And as it plays out, it often impacts the relationship with spouse and children, and of course the siblings, because care is rarely shared. It leads at a minimum to constant disagreements, and for many, unfortunately, even to estrangement. And as a result, long-term care, although can bring families together, often it tears them apart. The second thing that we know is that paying for care causes a reallocation of resources, starting with income, and the considerable problem that clients who have found success generally live on all or close to all of their income in retirement, as they did in their working years. And shifting income to pay for care has a direct impact on the client's ability to keep financial commitments, which may include having a child living through the pandemic, right, and needs financial help, providing with any children with special needs, helping grandchildren with their education, lifestyle expenses, which may include a vacation home or club memberships, or even continuing commitments to charities such as HERJC, right, in the temple. Although in theory, many of these expenses may be considered discretionary, in the real world, for many, they often aren't. And if the illness lasts long enough, it invariably leads to an invasion of portfolio capital, the purpose of which was to provide a predictable income stream. So, in short, paying for care can be very disruptive, and it's something that we all want to be mindful of. And so what we have to recognize is many people will say, this won't happen to me, right? We don't buy homeowners insurance expecting to put in a claim because the house catches fire. We don't buy automobile insurance expecting that you're going to go crash your car and need to replace it, right? We don't buy long-term care insurance expecting that we're going to need it. But the consequences, the irreversible consequences to the family, are so significant That's why we need to think about doing long-term care planning. And what I think is really important to understand is that long-term care may not be a vacation, but deserves a similar thought and planning. So think about this. I would imagine by a show of hands, everyone here has been to Disney. Okay. And in all likelihood, you just didn't decide one day, today's the day. I'm just going to pack up my car, drive down to Florida and go to Disney. Like, we don't do that. And the reason why we don't do that, especially for Disney World, is because if you don't plan in advance, you're likely not going to get a hotel close to the park. And so now you don't have shuttle service, and now you're going to have to drive and pay for parking. You won't be able to get a fast pass because you haven't planned in advance. So now you're waiting on long lines, and you're certainly not going to get a meal with a cast of characters, right? You haven't done your planning. And so understanding that long-term care is an event and not a place, what we're doing is we're planning in advance to have the greatest chance of a successful outcome, not only for you, but really more importantly, for your family. Right? So when we think about this, what are the differences between a vacation and a long-term care event? Well, when we think about the time, vacations are taken at our own convenience. Long-term care events cannot be predicted and don't happen at a convenient time. When we think about a vacation, if we need to, we can postpone them until we've saved enough money. But when we have a long-term care event, we can't postpone it and say, nope, this isn't a good time. On the other hand, what are the similarities between long-term care and event and planning for a vacation? Well, you get to decide where you want to go, who you want to have around, and potentially, what activities are happening at the same time. And it's true that we plan in so many other areas of our life, but very rarely do we have an extended plan of care. Very rarely do we sit down with our children or with our own parents to discuss this really important potential event in our lives. And the first thing to do, and I'll call it even a love letter, right? But the first thing to do is to understand yourself and to communicate that with the ones that you love. Why is this important to you? Right? Have you had an experience that didn't go well? Right? I think about my aunt. She started showing signs of dementia, and her two children who lived out of the state were in complete denial. No, it's just getting old. And one thing led to another where finally, there was a family intervention. And eventually we got somebody in twice a week to her apartment. And then it was 5 days a week. And then my cousin needed to tell her that they were taking her on vacation and literally moved her to another city and told her now she was going to have 2 homes. And one thing continued and lasted. And this whole thing went on for 8 years. But at least she had insurance, but she wasn't able to dictate to her children where she wanted to be. They were the ones that reacted instead of being proactive and following the plan that my aunt wanted. So I think it's really important that you share why it's important to you. And then you're talking about what's the ideal scenario. So first is, where do you want to be? Do you want to be at home versus being dropped off at adult daycare several days a week versus assisted living versus nursing home care versus an Alzheimer wing, hospice care? Like, where do you want to be? And who do you want to give the care? So one of the things that I've learned over my 25 years of selling long-term care insurance is the first place most people want to be is at home. They want loved ones taking care of them. So forget about the impact financially on loved ones, potentially having to leave work. Physically, are they able to do it? You know, when I have a man and a woman and there's a huge discrepancy physically, you know, it's not possible in many situations if it's, you know, one or the other, that the caretaker could even help somebody off the ground. Even though somebody can be trained, but the emotional and physical abuse, especially as it relates to Alzheimer's, that happens among family members is so significant and well documented. So then I'll hear people say, well, I'll just get other informal care. You know, the woman that cleaned our house for 20 years, I love her, I trust her, and I know she would do that for me. And that might be part of the solution, but I want you to think really clearly about, is that a good solution? So what are the concerns that we have with informal care? Well, certainly it's often less expensive. And knowing that person is an intangible that we can't measure. But what if that person doesn't show up? Where's the backup? Right? If the person isn't on the books, you can't deduct what you're paying as an expense unless you're, you know, obviously have them on the books and withholding into taxes and paying into the Social Security system and Medicare. You've probably never done a background check on this person. And they're probably not trained properly. For those of you who remember Jordan Zeitz, many years ago, he was in a horrific car accident when he was in college. And I happened to be visiting him when he was in New York City at Rusk. And he had come out of the coma and they were teaching him how to, you know, speak again and eat again and walk again. And I happened to be in the hospital the day they were teaching Donna how to transfer Jordan from a bed to a chair and vice versa. And when you actually think about it, you don't really think, oh, that's a big deal. But every step so that they wouldn't both tumble and fall and hurt each other, right, was so important. And so when you have informal care, you know, just the getting somebody to the bathroom, right? If they're not trained in doing it, one shouldn't presume that they know how to do it properly and safely. And then lastly, what if the informal caregiver gets hurt on the job? What are you doing, right? What's your umbrella insurance look like? They may love you, but that may not stop them from suing you. So again, success lies in the planning. Are you going to have, if you're going to be at home, we want to make sure that the folks that are helping, if you're not using somebody who's licensed, have been trained. And we want to be mindful that there is a physical and emotional toll on the caregivers. We want to communicate those wishes to the family as to also, where do you want to be physically? Are you staying in your own community? Or if your children and or parents are located elsewhere, are you moving closer to them or are you bringing them closer to you to make the management and the giving of the care easier? Is there a backup plan? Are all your documents in place? HIPAA release forms, DNR, a list of all the medications that you take and what doctor prescribes them and the pharmacies. Who's the financial advisor? And are you the trusted advisor on your significant other plans? Or who's alpha child? Are they listed as a trusted advisor? Just, you know, aside and apart from long-term care planning, whenever I'm dealing with older clients in my business, it's really important for me to know, one, who's the trusted advisor, and two, if I recognize and have concerns about your cognitive ability, who am I telling, right? Having those conversations, letting your trusted advisors know. If there's ever a point where you feel like the conversations that we've been having aren't similar to ones in the past, this is who I want you to contact. Because often when we start to become impaired, we don't recognize it ourselves, or we're in denial ourselves. And I think the other part, and we'll spend some more time on this shortly, is how do we fund the plan, which we'll get to in a moment. But the last part of the plan is a thank you in advance. Whether it's family and friends who are going to be the caregivers or on managing the care, it's a really hard job. And letting them know that you trust them to do the right thing is really, really important. But if you give them the guidelines as to what you want and where you want to be and how it's going to get paid for, it makes it a whole lot easier for them to implement the plan instead of trying to figure it out reactively when they're under stress. So we'll talk a little bit about funding the plan and recognizing that self-funding is what I'll call unsuring. Because to self-fund, you have to know how long you need to save and the rate of return that you need to get in order to set aside the amount of money that you might possibly need. Versus using an insurance contract, which provides immediate leverage, and it doesn't make a difference when the triggering event occurs. Now, this crowd is an older crowd. You may be past the point of being able to buy long-term care insurance, and maybe you already have some in place. But if that's not part of the funding, it's really important, again, that you sit down with yourself, with your financial advisor, with your children, whoever is going to be in charge, and talk about how long-term care should get paid for. What accounts are there? What do we need to liquidate? And be mindful that there may be some unavoidable tax consequences. When we use insurance, we're using pennies on the dollar to transfer the risk. But when we're self-funding, we're using dollar for dollar at that time in order to pay for the care. And if you have to liquidate from qualified accounts, the ones that the government becomes your partner now at age 72, it may put you potentially in a higher income tax bracket. So being strategic about where the dollars come from is also something to pay attention to over time. Let me just go back to my agenda. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. I just want to talk a little bit about long-term care. I don't know if this statistic, 70% of people turning age 65 will need some form of long-term care during their remaining lives, sounds high or low to you. But the reality is the longer we live, the more likely we're going to need care. And certainly if we're well into our 80s, cognitive impairments become, unfortunately, even more popular, not in a good way. So these are all the risks that we face as we're getting older and think about retirement. With long-term care, again, as I just mentioned, the older we get, the more likely we're going to need it. Modern medicine has done an incredible job of keeping us alive, but not necessarily without assistance. Right? When we think about long-term care, whether physical or cognitive in nature, again, these are chronic illnesses that we can manage but get worse over time. And I think that for most of us, what do we want? We want to lead a life with dignity. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the question is, how do you do that? I know for me, I've got 2 boys. Who knows where they'll be in their life if I need care. I certainly don't want them, wiping my tuchus, right? I want to make sure that they could be the ones to manage the care, but not necessarily the ones to give the care. But having that difficult conversation with kids is really step 1 of moving forward. I think the other thing to recognize is that the cost of care is significant. And that's why often people choose to stay home, because to move into any kind of facility is a lot of money, right? And people would rather be in the comfort of their own home. Grandchildren would rather visit their grandparents in the grandparents' home. They don't want to go to a nursing home or an assisted living facility. It's scary to them. These are median costs. We know that here in the New York metropolitan area, the cost of a facility is significantly higher than it is, let's say, in Florida. And that's all because of real estate and taxes. Yet the cost of care for somebody in the house, although this is a large number and this is an hourly rate, and if you're paying people by shifts as opposed to hours, it's less expensive. It's going to cost relatively less here than it will in other parts of the country. Think about Alaska, for example, right? They don't have nearly as many people potentially doing this kind of work, or the transportation system. So recognize that in certain parts of the country, the cost of care is going to be significantly less, especially in facilities. When we talk about buying long-term care insurance, I know, again, this is an older group, but just recognizing, if you're having this conversation with your own children and their planning, that the younger you are, the more likely you're able to get the insurance.
And less money.
And of course, it's less money. Again, for most of us, as we get older, we don't get healthier. And things that you wouldn't expect to cause an impact in both price and the ability to get insurance often can and will. And so you've got to get insurance when you're younger and healthier, when you don't need it. The other thing that's really important to understand for some of you, if you are still working in any kind of capacity and have self-employed income, or are a partner in any kind of small firm or even a large firm, you can deduct above the line on your federal return a portion of the premium paid for both you and a spouse or companion, depending upon your age. And if you have any kind of non-qualified permanent life annuity or whole life insurance, or you have an HSA account or an HRA account, there are ways to pay for long-term care premiums that are going to be tax-free. In the state of New York and many other states, premiums that are paid, you get a 20% tax credit for any premium paid during the taxable year. That's New York. It's one of the most generous states that provides a tax benefit. The other thing that I'll just mention before I move on is, if you're in a position to purchase long-term care insurance, the number of providers that are available today compared to 20 years ago is very different. The industry has gone through a lot of changes. I'm more than happy to have that conversation offline. But at HERJC, I set up a multi-life discount. So typically when you buy long-term care insurance, if you're buying it as a single individual with no spouse, there's no discount. With a spouse, there is a discount, whether the spouse purchases it or not, a larger one if both are getting coverage. But as a member of HERJC, there's an additional 5% discount on any policies purchased at Northwestern Mutual, which is the company that I primarily represent. So that's, just wanted to mention that. So I think that the only thing that I haven't really talked about is, what exactly is long-term care, right? It's understanding that you need assistance with activities of daily living. And typically there are 6 of them: bathing, dressing, eating, what I'll call toileting, like being able to go to the bathroom, transferring from bed to chair and vice versa, as well as continence, right? The ability to hold your bladder valves. That is a chronic issue that we're dealing with, as opposed to an acute illness, which you are expected to recover from, which Medicare will generally pay. If you've been in a hospital for 3 days and wind up at a facility, they'll full pay for 20 days and co-pay for the next 80. Or if you're at home, for example, we'll send a nurse to the home for a period of time. So even like a quadruple bypass, although it's a serious and significant surgery, that's considered an acute illness, which you are expected to recover from within 90 days, as opposed to a chronic illness, which we expect will last longer than the 90 days. So I think that's a good place for me to pause and answer any questions that you may have. Thus far, I don't see any. So I don't know if you have any.
Audrey,
Yes.
I agree with everything. I've had this care for about 15 years for both. I had it for Louise and for me, and it's with different company, but that's beside the point. But it's incredible. This just has to be brought to the attention, I think, and you stated it, the people who are probably in their mid 40s or 50s, because that's when they got to do this. The amount of savings in 1 year, my goodness, could be over $100,000 or more of your keeping your own monies. It's
Correct.
incredible. The need, if hopefully you never need it, including that, but what can I
That's
say?
correct.
Couldn't
And
agree
I
with
think
you
for this, for the majority of the people on this call,
Yeah, the one need younger.
it's really having the conversation with your spouse, if there is one, but more importantly with the children. They need to know what planning you've put in place, if any, just quite yet. They need to know where to find the important documents. They need to know what you want in the event that you need care. Some people that I know, no matter what, I want to stay in my house, right? That's really important to them. And then ultimately what happens for many people is, if there isn't a spouse, it gets pretty lonely in the house. And if it's physical, not necessarily cognitive, right? Maybe being in a facility at some point would actually be better, being exposed to other people and having programming, right? If you're in good shape mentally, right? Having the stimulation, having concerts, right? Obviously not during the pandemic, having a library, having art classes, having dance classes. That may actually be better for an individual who doesn't have anybody else, living around the clock with them. Or being in a facility that is geared towards those that have cognitive impairments. Again, I think more important than anything else is making sure to have these difficult conversations with your children so that they know what you want and what they need to do in order to fulfill your wishes, but also empowering them that if you can't make those decisions on your own any longer, that you're trusting them to do so. And especially when there's more than one child, right? There's usually an alpha child. There might be the alpha child who is there for physical care, but there also might be an alpha child who's there for the finances, and maybe they don't see eye to eye. So trying to get everybody on the same page, around the table, so to speak, on the Zoom screen together, as uncomfortable as it may be, they will thank you at the end of the day if this should come to pass. And hopefully it won't. My family's MO is really very interesting. It used to be you'd wake up one morning, you say your heart hurts, you have a massive coronary, and you're done, right? Not great for the family because there was really no time to say goodbye. But on the other hand, no suffering, right? No debilitating illnesses. Now, on my mom's side of the family, they fixed the ticker. You live 20 years longer, but you wind up with dementia, right? That's my mom's MO, like her family, her two older siblings, et cetera. And so it's inevitable until we have cures for some of these chronic illnesses, until we have drugs that aren't going to slow down Alzheimer's and dementia, but will cure it, right? We can live a lot longer with these impairments, but not necessarily without help. And I can't stress enough for those of you that are on this call, for yourselves to have the conversations with the younger set, and also to share with your children the importance of them starting to do their own planning, as challenging as it may be, right? We're generally with younger kids, we're worried about life insurance and long-term disability insurance and college education planning, and the dollar can only go so far. But again, a good plan doesn't necessarily begin with insurance. A good plan begins with, what do I want to have happen? Where do I want to be? Are all my documents in one place, including passwords, right? Everything to make it easier, the person who's standing by on the side.
Audrey, coming back to something that you just said, for our children, because as you say, most of us will be on the age of getting insurance if we don't already have it. Realistically, at what age should somebody start thinking about actually purchasing long-term care insurance? I know you say as soon as possible, but a 30-year-old, I believe, would just be too young. So what's...
Right. So there's two different ways to purchase long-term care insurance. The first, which I believe is the most efficient, is what we call standalone insurance, right? So standalone is a policy that's meant specifically for long-term care planning. And generally speaking, clients in their early 50s should be thinking about buying standalone insurance. For the younger set, on life insurance policies today, you have the ability to put on what we call an accelerated care benefit. It's a hybrid, right? It allows you to access money if needed for long-term care. And if you're buying life insurance in the first place to protect the young family, tacking on that rider is a way to get some coverage at a younger age. It may not be ideal, but if it turns out they're never in a position to buy a standalone policy, they at least have something. And it's a very efficient way to have some amount of protection at a younger age.
At what age would you recommend people look into that?
20s, 30s, 40s.
Oh, so very young.
Very young. Absolutely. I mean, Jordan Zides is a perfect example, right? He was 19 years old and needed long-term care. You'd be surprised statistically how many people need long-term care before, age 65. So that's the answer to that question. Any others? Vicky, you're on, unmute yourself.
Good.
I unmuted her.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to say, we got our long-term care insurance quite early. I don't even know if we were 50. And I find that over the years that every year the prices have gone up.
Okay.
And so I just wanted to make people aware of that.
So,
We were so careful to try to get the best for the least amounts of money, but now we keep getting increases.
Yeah. So I would love to spend a few minutes on that. First and foremost, who you get into bed with is the most important decision you make when you buy long-term care insurance. You want the company that is selling the policy to be there to pay the claim. But back in the mid-1990s, when the new tax-qualified long-term care policies came to market, everybody in every life insurance company decided to jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, we're going to start selling long-term care insurance. And at that time, interest rates were significantly higher than they are today and have been for quite a few years. The companies underpriced inflation riders purposely to gain market share. They never anticipated that claims would come in at some of the younger ages that they did. And the other piece of this, which is technical in nature, but long-term care pricing is also based on what we call lapse ratios. Important to understand that for every 100 policies that are put on the books, there's an expectation that a certain amount of those won't renew. And what they actuaries in most of the industry thought is that it would look the same for long-term care as it does for life insurance. In the life insurance industry, for every 100 policies that are put on the books each year, approximately 7 to 8% don't renew the following year. In long-term care, that's what they thought was going to happen. Only what did happen is 2 to 3% decided that they weren't going to renew. And although 4 to 5% doesn't sound like a very large number, it's a huge number. And so the stars were not aligned in a good place when everybody was buying long-term care in the mid-1990s through the early 2000s. The industry was young. They didn't have the data to back up the numbers. You could buy lifetime benefits. Pricing for men and women were the same. Life was a whole lot different than it is today. And so inevitably, the majority of the companies that were the leading providers of long-term care in 2000 are no longer in the marketplace today. They sold off their business or they stopped writing insurance, and there was no incentive to keep premiums down, right? They knew that they were going to need to pay out a lot of claims. So they went to the state insurance commissions and they said, we need to raise our rates. And for a long time, state insurance commissions allowed that to happen unfettered. And so premiums of these older policies kept getting raised. But along the way, those that were remaining in the business started to change and come up with new contracts. Lifetime benefits are no longer available. Men and women are charged different premiums. A lot has changed. And so the stability today, the contracts today, although I can't promise anything from anybody, but they have incorporated all of the learning of the last 25 years, right? They've incorporated the low interest rate environment. They don't allow lifetime benefits because we've got these cognitive impairments that people can live with a really long time. We know that men, typical, this is stereotypical, but typically men are older in the marriage, they need care first. We as the wives take care of them. We then need care ourselves. We live longer. So the pricing now is better for men and women. So a lot has changed. But unfortunately, for those that purchased insurance at a similar time to you, Vicky, and even probably years after, those older contracts, you're caught between a rock and a hard place. Do I keep what I have, or do I lower my benefit to keep the same premium? Recognize, in my opinion, any amount of protection is better than none, right? You're still using pennies on the dollar to pay for care. And generally it's a reimbursement of dollars. There's no taxes on it. And again, depending upon, what you purchased, you're living in New York, you're paying a premium, you're getting that back, a part of that back as a tax credit on your New York return.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm going to say one more thing. Because you keep seeing the advertisements of the people on the couches sitting while their children are helping them and their children are getting paid and supposedly taking better care than a caretaker would. And I was wondering if a lot of people are doing that. Not for us, but just in general.
Could you, I missed that. Could you repeat that one more time?
You see all sorts of advertisements where now things became that your child can leave their job and get paid for taking care of a parent or whoever.
Sure.
And
So
a lot of people doing that.
Yeah. So it's good for the child that isn't losing out, right? Because they're allowed to take paid time off. But the question once again is that what you want for your child, right?
Right.
Again, I look at my situation. I have two sons. And, if they were the ones having to take care of me, that's not what I want, right?
Absolutely.
So it also might impact their ability to, move up in the world at work, right? If they're taking time off, even though there's not supposed to be any type of harm done to them. But if you're not there to do your job, it's hard to maintain that. And I think the biggest thing to just recognize, and a lot of this is specific to everybody's situation.
Right.
But the studies that have been done about the abuse of caretakers when it's family members, in particular, as it relates to cognitive impairments, especially Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's patients can get very violent and nasty. And there are documentaries out there. I mean, there's material that I get in my line of business, but that's a real issue. It's not meant, to say this is why you've got to go get insurance, or you've got to hire somebody else. Sometimes it's the only option is family members.
Sure.
But recognizing how stressful it is emotionally, and not poo-pooing that. It's just important to understand that.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't thinking of doing it, but I do know a lot of people who have chosen to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, Art?
Yeah, hi. My insurance agent sold me a policy with a $100,000 death benefit, but he told me it's also long-term care. I can take out $25,000 a year to help pay for long-term care for up to 4 years, obviously. And if, let's say you died after 2 years, then you'd still get $50,000 in life insurance after using up $50,000 for the long-term care. Do you like that policy?
So on its face,
Sounds great, right?
on its face, it's better than nothing, right? Without looking at the fine print, right?
Yeah.
Again, this is the analogy that I like to use. And again, unfortunately, it's the pandemic, so it's not even an option. But if you wanted to spend a night out in Manhattan and you wanted to have dinner and go to the theater, and you wanted the best night possible. You're going out to the finest restaurant you can find and afford and the best show, right? So let's call it, I don't know, Capitol Grill. You want a good steakhouse in Hamilton.
Right.
Compare that experience to going to Forestburg dinner theater, right? Generally speaking, the show isn't as good, nor is the meal. So when you think about insurance, when you're buying a product to do a specific thing. When you're asking it to do more than one thing, it can't do both equally as well. And so if you want long-term care, it's more efficient to spend your dollars on a long-term care policy. If you want life insurance, it's more efficient to spend the money on life insurance policy. But sometimes the best that we can do is put them together. And it doesn't mean it's bad. It's just not as efficient, right? Because if you wanted the death benefit, but then you wind up using it for long-term care, you don't have the death benefit and vice versa. But it doesn't mean that it's bad.
Audrey, on another topic I found with myself, I was just told the rates went up a little bit. I'm sure you know that for all these policies. And then you have these benefits. I have lifetime, and you could take it for 6 years or 10 years or reduced rates. And when I did all those calculations, and I hope I did the right one, I stayed where I was with the pay the extra, even if it's $100 more a month, because God forbid you need it. The difference in the cut of what they'll pay you in a particular day, or if you go to a lesser lifespan, within 1 year, you've lost it. You know, I was doing the math of all these different formulas that you do. So you're better off sometimes just staying with the best, probably the best product, which I took out about 15, 20 years ago. And also, unfortunately, I had to, for a short time when I used it for Louise, they paid for a lot of things, you know, like special beds and stair lifts and stuff. You know, they do a lot of important things that cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot in many situations, it often comes down to dollars and cents. What's, you know, what can you do? But I think the biggest concern that we have ourselves right now are the cognitive impairments. The length of claim is on average twice as long as a physical impairment. We can live with these diseases a long time, but not necessarily without assistance.
Yeah.
Audrey,
Yes.
I have long-term care insurance and I took it for 6 years, quite a long time ago.
Mhm.
And yes, the rates, it happens to have just renewed this week, but the letter that I got, the rates went up, you know, with all the options.
Yeah.
And I called the company. Now, the person who sold me the insurance has passed away. And believe it or not, they said they have nobody there that can advise me what to do. I could not believe that.
What do you want to say? I mean, I had John Hancock.
That's what it is, John Hancock. And I could have just been, what?
I mean, on my case, we took it out a long time ago, about 15
I
years.
took it out a long time ago also, but I could not believe that the person on the phone said to me, there's no one here that can advise you.
Wow.
She said, you have to speak to your agent. I said, well, he passed away. Well, there's no one here. Now, I could have called back the next day. Instead, I spoke to other people. You know, hopefully if I called back the next day, I'd get someone else on the phone. But how could that be, that there's no one to advise you?
Yeah. So again, what I said before, who you get into bed with is really the most important. But it sounds like you found somebody to help. But if you still need help and you want to reach out to me offline, I'm more than happy to go over that with you. Like I said before, I'm primarily affiliated with Northwestern Mutual, but I am licensed to sell pretty much every other insurance company. So I can help if need be.
All right, well, I just renewed it. I mean, I just literally sent the check yesterday, but it was
that's unfortunate. Like Hancock's one of the companies that, you know, stopped selling and they don't care as much. So they don't put as much money into the servicing, but ultimately if you pushed it long and hard enough, they would reassign you to somebody else who could help.
I pushed them.
Well,
very
that's what I
through.
thought. I thought the person that I happened to get was just too lazy to be bothered. I would have called another day, but instead I spoke to a few other people and made my decision, which was to stay as it was.
And I will tell you in regard to that. So for example, if I took over a policy for a colleague that I knew that there was no additional business coming my way, right? So I wouldn't receive renewals on your contract. And so there are some representatives out there that say, well, I'm not going to spend my time and bother to help this person because there's nothing in it, quote unquote, for me. But there are
But
folks.
what happens if I need the help? I mean, if God forbid my kids had to contact somebody there because I needed it,
Right. So they would
they
be
would give me the help.
Right. They would be contacting the claims department, and the claims department would assign somebody to your case, and your children would have somebody to work with.
Yeah.
Okay.
But ultimately, there are other people out there like myself that will help, even though there may not necessarily be compensation. So recognize that there still are good people out there that, are going to do the job. And sometimes, unfortunately, it takes a little bit of additional, persistence on your end, which you shouldn't have to do, but sometimes
Right.
that's what you need.
You got to be a little pushy sometimes. Yeah, but you get
You're right.
Anybody else? All right.
All right, Audrey. Oh, I'm sorry. Did somebody have a question? Audrey, let me thank you again.
Thank you.
Not exactly an uplifting topic, but something that we all do have to hear. I believe we have no one scheduled for next week, but in 2 weeks, Rabbi Schlesinger is going to be speaking, and I hope everybody will be able to attend that session. That should be very interesting. And the week after is going to be a representative from Hatzulu. I believe his name is Alan Levine. Joe, is that correct?
That's right. Hatzulu Rescue Organization. Alan Levine, the president, will be talking.
That'll be in 3 weeks. And then the week after that, Lisa Cohn is going to be speaking about poems to make us feel better, I believe. So thank you again, Audrey. Thank you all for attending. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you,
Happy
Audrey.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year. Anybody?
Thank you, Audrey.
Thanks. Harold, can you stay on a minute?
Sure.
Thanks.